Hello everyone, my name is Damir and welcome to another masterclass from Snappic. Today we will discuss the DSLR. I will be using the Canon M50 Mark I. It's the most commonly used camera with the photo booth industry. Which lens you use, that will all depend on you and what you need to capture. So do keep we'll discuss that later, and I'll explain a little bit more when it comes to lenses. I will go through the use cases. I will include the Snappic articles that can be used to set up the camera, as well as some interesting links. So the first link is just a help center from the Snappic, and then the second two links, you can open them, and will also allow you to play around with a camera on the screen without using the real camera. It's good for practice, but I would recommend using a real camera if you have a chance to go out and then play with the settings and try and do the manual settings by yourself. So the exposure triangle, it's the most important thing that a photographer can learn when starting, which is shutter, aperture, and ISO. A good understanding of aperture, shutter, and ISO will differentiate you from a professional photographer versus a casual photographer. The camera functions are responsible for image exposure, the level of light and dark tones in your photo. It will play a significant role in the overall look of the image. The first step to mastering aperture, shutter, and ISO is to switch your camera from automatic mode and then make it a full manual mode. From there, you will be able to set up everything and play around with the settings that we're going to go over today. Setting your exposure manually will take some time to master, but don't worry, once you master it, it will take mere seconds to adjust the camera to whatever you need. Once we know how to set up the camera in manual mode, this will improve the quality of your videos, images, as the camera will have a perfect setting for your environment. Your environment will dictate how to set up a DSLR and the light. And of course, don't think that having a DSLR in an automatic mode would fix all the problems, because if you are in a dark environment, the camera will go very high on the ISO, and the manual mode will create a lot of problems in that environment, especially if there's a lot of light changing. So to get started, let's look at the exposure settings in detail, how each can influence artistic image properties and how they all work together. To start with, the most commonly used settings to start from will be a shutter speed 1/125, aperture anywhere between f8 and f12, and ISO set to 100 to 200. And this is something that's mostly used in daylight sunshine photography. The only time you would need to change the aperture on a higher or a shutter speed is if it's really bright and you're using a manual mode with a flash, then it can change and vary quite a bit. So this is the Canon's webpage, and this is very good to practice manual mode. You can also set it to shutter priority and aperture priority. But for example, as I said, we can always start from f8, which is aperture, put 125, and then put the ISO on low, 100. From here, snap a photo. You'll see how it's very dark because this is a room environment. It just depends on the lights inside of your room. In case you want to fix this image now, for example, from the shot that is very dark, from here, what I would do is I would drop down an aperture. Do note that aperture will also make the depth of field a little bit more narrow the lower you go. So if you have a big group of people and they're in like 2 or 3 rows, that will affect it quite a lot. So if you take a picture on a low aperture, you can see the picture became a little bit brighter. So from here, again, it will depend on a type of event that is. I wouldn't recommend going under 1/25th of a second for the shutter speed because the movement will start being very much noticeable. So from here, I would say you can go ISO 400 and see how the image will look like. This is already a great image, and I would stick with these settings. So let's continue from here. So as I said, from here, the first thing to adjust for more light will be to drop the aperture to a lower number. This means the amount of light that will hit the sensor. The aperture inside of the camera, I'm not sure if you guys can see me. Just one moment. So the aperture of the camera is how much light comes in through the sensor. The more it's opened, the more light comes in, the bigger the bokeh effect will become, which means the blurriness in the background. And the smaller it is, the less light will come into the sensor. And this will also create a larger aperture area, which will then include more people if you have more rows of people to take photos of. And but it will create less light in the camera, so other parts like ISO and shutter speed will then need to be adjusted. But so this is just an explanation on how the aperture works, which means the smaller the circle, the less the light comes in, the bigger the circle, the more the light comes in, and it will be more sensitive on the sensor, so the image will be brighter. If you open the cheat sheet, if everybody has it, the aperture really explains that also. If there's a wide opening and a narrow opening, and then it says it's darker when it's narrower and it's brighter when it's more open. The next part we will look at will be the shutter speed. It will depend on what kind of an event it will be and how much movement you expect from the guest when taking a photo. The faster the shutter speed, the less the movement the photo will show, and the slower the shutter speed, the more the movement will show. Okay, in this case, it will look like the guest is blurred, but everything else focused because the guest was moving and then the background wasn't. So it will look like a motion picture, like in any case. So let's say we set up our shutter speed at 250. We would need to raise the ISO a little bit and then take a photo. In this case, you can see a motion blur from the propeller, but do note that propeller is actually spinning quite fast. So if you would go down on the shutter speed, we can go down on the ISO a little bit and take a picture. You can see the image is a bit brighter. I just didn't set it up correctly, but you can see the propeller is actually losing focus completely and it's creating a motion blur. So it's important to keep the shutter speed over 125. The last part I want to talk to you is the ISO. I can't recommend anything higher than the 400 ISO. But if you have a newer camera, then it would be better it will handle better the low light situations. But I would still recommend rather use light to expose better because you will get a lot of graininess. So I will show you that now if you can see this in this picture. So we'll put up ISO very high, just so we see how it looks like. I'm just gonna, there we go. Now you can see the graininess in the photo that it created. So the higher the ISO, you will get the more graininess. Now you do have some events probably that people would enjoy this old style type of photography, but I haven't seen too many against the good exposure, which we'll set up now, which would be 125 with ISO about 200. And then we can drop the aperture. Well, we can move the ISO to 400, so I will be okay with that. And you get a nicely exposed photo that will look great. So for people and movement of people, it's not like the propeller on the plane. They would look great on 1/125, which is 1/25 of a second, the speed of the shutter. And then the ISO 400, the higher you go, the more noise you will get. Some people don't like it. Sorry. Yeah. So the last part, when thinking of using a DSLR for your photo boot, would be to consider what type of light will you use. Will you be using a speed light or a flash, or will you be using a constant light? So yeah, if the event is in a closed venue and you don't have the sun to worry about, this setup will be a good example and will not have too many variables. A good amount of lights will create a very good photos. If you can use a flash, it will be more beneficial because flash can expose much better. But then you will need to be careful on how you're setting up the camera for flash photography. And I will go through that a little bit at the later stage when I go through everything. And then it will be a different story for a photo booth that will be outdoors. From my side, I would always recommend a flash with a softbox or anything to soften the harsh effect of the flash, as it will help if the weather changes. In this case, it will be better to have a flash that supports a TTL. TTL is used for communication between the camera and the flash, and in this instance, flash will decide how strong it needs to be when the camera is set to aperture mode. So if you are doing an event and it's outdoors and the sun is really harsh, I would recommend using a flash that has a support for TTL, which is that communication link, because if you set the camera to aperture mode, your shutter speed and ISO will stay locked into manual settings, and then aperture will adjust on the amount of light that it will allow for the camera to capture. So for example, if a cloud comes and it stops the sun from shining on you, that photo will become really dark if it's a full manual mode. But if it's on aperture priority with the flash that support it, then the aperture will adjust that light compensation and will tell the flash, hey, flash the specific amount of light so it doesn't get you overexposed or underexposed. So it will work really good. The best flash to use will be the same as the manufacturer of the camera, Canon for Canon, Nikon for Nikon. A manual flash would work also, but this will need quite a bit of practice if you're planning to use a manual flash. The reason why using a manufacturer's flash is because they will not always support TTL out of the box. For example, Canon cameras, let me just change my screen quickly. Okay, for example, Canon cameras through the shoebox have a full communication with their own flashes. So if you get a Canon camera that has a TTL support, you will be able to connect it to the camera, and while connected to your iPad, it will work. While some flashes will not work because the camera doesn't have support for the flash. So it's a variable thing. So it needs to be tested before you can actually use the flash with the photo booth, because what happens is once you plug in your photo booth via the USB cable, some flashes will just refuse to fire. They will just not work because the camera doesn't support the USB connectivity with a flash attached to it. So yeah, suppose you don't have a photographer that understands the DSLR in a manual mode, it will be better to set the camera to aperture priority, as we discussed already. In this case, the camera will set up the aperture automatically and keep the shutter and ISO to manual. This will help in case there are clouds and light conditions change significantly. So it will help quite a bit if you have an unattended booth or if you have an attending that doesn't know how to set up the camera again. We can go to how to use a DSLR with Snappic. Setting up the DSLR to take photos, the camera will need to be set to photo mode or any of the photo modes, which is aperture priority, manual priority, shutter priority, which is set, on this dial here. It will depend on the venue and how. The camera can be set to auto mode for venues with constant light and doesn't have a disco lights, which will work in most cases. Still, if you are in a venue with variable ambient light, then an aperture priority will be beneficial. Setting up the DSLR to take videos. So the camera will need to be set to video mode. Again, it's on the same dial. This is mostly for mirrorless cameras. It will be on the same dial. You will see a small camera that will be on video mode. So the video mode will be similar in setup, but you won't be able to use aperture mode as it will be set to video mode. In this case, you can leave the camera to auto settings if the light is constant. And in case you have a variable light and are using the lights around the 360 stands, it will be better to use manual settings and have a consistently good looking videos. Reason behind this that in case the DSLR is pointed at a strong light, it will try and compensate so the video will turn out dark. So for example, let's say you set up the camera to a daytime light and then the cloud comes. So if it's on manual mode, the images just will become darker. So it applies the same for video. If you are in a closed environment and let's say you're using the 4 light stands around and a ring light in front of the camera, what will happen is, let's say if you set it to full automatic and the lens can still see a shine from the spotlights that are standing around the 360 booth, what will happen is that light will come into the camera, the automatic mode from the camera will then think, hey, I'm looking at a light, I need to compensate for that. It will create the main video and the guests standing on the 360 booth a bit darker because of that light shining at the camera. I hope that makes sense. And then the third part is setting up a photo and video for the same event. This is if you would like to use the camera to capture photos and videos at the same time. The camera in this case will need to be set in the photo mode, any of them. And then the pro on this would be you can use the video effects to create great bursts in videos, but con for this would be slow motion can't be used as it is only available in video mode. So for example, the burst and GIF would work great because if you use a video effects template, because it only has 30 frames a second, if you set it up to use slow motion, it will actually glitch it a little bit. So it will look like you're using burst or GIF. So it's like a beneficial, but it's you will need to play around with these templates to be able to see how it's going to look like. Then recommended cameras that can record slow motion videos. Most commonly used cameras. So when choosing a DSLR, you need to consider what DSLR will be used for, as not all cameras offer same functions regarding video recording. In this case, almost all new DSLR mirrorless cameras will record in slow motion, but please do a research to just be sure that they are doing that slow motion. For example, the Canon that we are presenting now, the EOS M50 Mark I and Mark II, they both do a slow motion when set on video mode, but it will need to be, you will need to go into settings and enable the slow motion settings, which will actually record the video at 720p. Don't worry about the recording in 720p because DSLRs have quite a large sensor. So when they upscale the video to 1080p, it looks great. You won't even see the difference when you're looking at that on a phone or even on a screen. So that's a minor thing to worry about. Almost all DSLR cameras will have a great output when choosing the DSLR for your photos. This means that images and videos will look great if the camera is set up correctly. 90% of the new mirrorless cameras, will support a slow motion recording. So when it comes to DSLR for photography, if you are not going to use it for slow motion video and 360 videos, you can even go with the basic cropped sensor camera, which would be the beginner's camera that is supported with Snappic is Canon T6. That's a Canon Rebel T6. And that would be the cheapest camera that you can use that will still create great photos. And then photos versus videos, main differences, how the camera will use the sensor. So I would like to mention that taking photos and videos on DSLR is different, as cameras usually don't use the full sensor size for the video. For example, if let's say a a full sensor camera is called a 35 millimeter sensor, which is like a square like this. And then when it comes to video recording, sorry about that. So let's say that this square here is a sensor, and let's say this is 35 millimeters. And in that case, the camera will take a photo with a full sensor and use it that way. When it comes to video, it will show you this sensor, but the moment when it starts recording the video, it will crop a little bit because it won't be using a full sensor to record a video. Otherwise, that would probably be like a 2K video and very high resolution. So it compensates for that part. When using your DSLR camera for video, you would either need to use a lens that supports wide angle. This is an 18 to 55 millimeter lens. You would need to keep it quite a bit far from the 360 boot in order to capture a full length of the guest if you need to. So what would happen with this camera and the specific lens that's on it, I would recommend using like a portrait mode size for recording, but investing in a good fisheye lens will help a lot because specific fisheye lenses also come from about 12 millimeters to 18 millimeters. So you can always set up the distance instead of moving the camera far or close. And then I'm just gonna go with you through some scenarios on the situations and how to handle them. In case you ever have any questions, do note that you can always contact us on the live support chat. If you have any questions about the DSLRs, you can also send us a message. If I am around, I will always be able to reply, but if other team members are around, they can always note me in the message, and then I can always reply when I'm available. This is what we would use in this situations. However, as explained before, you will need to use the fundamentals to tweak the settings of the online. Okay, so the first scenario is environment with a good light, the light that doesn't change, which means it's a dream to have this perfect light. So optimal lighting, good natural or venue light, no direct sunlight. So for venues with optimal light settings, automatic mode is okay to use because every photo will come out great and camera will create the perfect photo in this case. But if you still need to watch for but for example, if the camera is set to focus on a specific part of the photo, and let's say you have a light dress or a dark dress, or a person is wearing like a very dark shirt. Like for example, the camera focuses on a dark shirt. It will compensate a little bit so that photo will be a little bit overexposed, but that won't really matter too much for auto mode, where the camera is set to automatic at the venue with this type of light conditions. Second scenario, environment lighting is very bright and tends to change depending on the daytime and the clouds. Direct sunlight. This is the worst case scenario unless you have a professional photographer documenting that event. So we recommend finding a good shade or having a gazebo where the camera will have a constant light. So you'll create a shade for yourself, and then it won't depend too much on the outside sources. In case this is not an option, setting up camera to aperture mode will work. And the back of the booth will need to be facing the sun, which means the guest will need to be facing about a little bit offset of the sun so that they don't close their eyes or squint. So about 30% to the left or to the right. So depending, the sun is there, your photo booth will be a little bit to the side. So let's say the photo booth is in front of you, the sun would need to be somewhere there. Then people can look at the photo booth, straight at it, and not be bothered by the direct sun behind the photo booth. So that's why it needs to be a little bit to one or the other side. Okay, scenario number 3. At night, no natural light and poor venue lighting. In this case, flash or consistent light will help. But if you want only to use the ring light, it will not be powerful enough. So we would recommend at least 2 additional light sources on each side of the photo booth as fill lights. This will make the photo booth the photos look much better. Also using a flash would help. If it's a venue with a nice brighter ceiling, if you don't have a softer flash, then you can point it up in the ceiling, which will then bounce all the light and it will create great photos. Because it's when working with flash photography, it's very hard if you have the background. So let's say the background is too close and you don't have space to move the people a little bit further. It is recommended anywhere between around 4 feet to 5 feet away from the backdrop. The reason for being this is so that it doesn't create a harsh shadow on the background, which is a lot of times, which I've seen a lot of that times happen because the guests don't know where to stand. So it's very important also to put something on the floor, like put a duct tape if it's allowed at the venue. If not, do try and have something that will tell the guest where to stand. But yeah. And fourth scenario, venue at night with venue constantly changing lighting conditions, with lights such as strobes, color lights, laser lights. So it's a big party and it's very hard to take photos in that type of venue. Screen not shared, sorry. Okay, so when you're at the party and the light is too random, so the camera will not know what to do, you will need to be able to overpower the venue and the party lighting. The only way to do this is to have a lot of consistent light sources or a good flash at the same time. The camera will need to be set to manual mode and not change any exposure settings, as the flash and constant light will do all the work for the camera. Constant lighting will help the camera focus on the guest, and flash will properly expose the photo. So what I mean to say in this explanation is, if you have a camera setup and you have a speed light or any flash connected to it, it's beneficial for parties like this to have something that is called a posing light, which is something that is constantly going to be shining at the guest that is in front of the camera, at least showing the camera where it can focus on the guest and then taking a photo. So if you don't have the posing light, then the camera will struggle in focusing and it will take a little bit longer to take a photo, or it will fail to take a photo. So it's a very variable. I haven't seen too many parties like this, but yeah, this is one of the headaches that anyone with a photo booth and no attending would have.